Okay, so I touched on a little bit of this stuff in one of the earlier lectures, but I want to talk today about publishing venues, how one publishes, a little bit more about open access, and predatory publishers. And so I will cover these different things. So first, and I think I hit some of this right, so as a professional scientist, you are a professional writer. Your primary job, or a large part of it at least, is to produce papers, to produce research and publish it. So you want to look at your profession as a professional writer and think about how you're managing your time from that point of view. So we always talk a little bit about a scientific paper. It's a paper written and published report describing the research ideas. And the publishing is an important part for us of a science paper, right? Even your thesis will officially be published. All UCCS theses, or most universities' theses, are published in publicly available documents. And they every now and then they do get cited. Lots of people chop the meaning of the papers. The papers tend to get more citations, but the thesis will sometimes have more details. To be a good scientific paper, it has to be the first publication of some original research results. Not all results in the paper have to be original, but at least some of them do. In a form where peers can repeat the experiments, test the conclusions, and in a journal or other source document readily available to the community. Right? So it's got to be available. It's got to be ideally something where you have enough detail for them to repeat experiments, and it's a real regional research publication. One of the reasons that white papers and other company things often are not considered scientific publications is this second element disappears, right? It may be publicly available, it may be the first report of a result, but they intentionally withhold information that keeps anyone from ever reproducing it. And if you can't reproduce it, it really isn't a good science paper. So, I mean, our goals are, when you're reading for a scientific paper, right, are to assess the observations, be able to repeat the experiments, to evaluate the intellectual process. How is this paper doing things so that I can try and build on it? In my view, it must have an impact. If I have a research paper that goes out and no one ever reads it, no one ever cites it, it's not really good, it's not a scientific paper. Right? It's published, it might have these other things, but no one cares enough to verify about it. It generally has to be available to the scientific community without restrictions. The without restrictions is a funny term because it often means that you have to pay for it, which is a restriction, but that's not considered a terrible restriction, as opposed to it's classified and only people with certain clearances can read it. Right? Might still be a scientific paper, but that's generally not going to make it if no one else can read it. And regularly available for regular screening by one or more of the major recognized secondary services. This last one to me is also important. A good scientific paper is one that is indexed, so that Google Scholar, Scopus, World Web of Science, other people index it and know where it is, because without that, people can't find it. Right? So it might be there, it might be published, and this is actually a problem for a while. Theses were not. Google Scholar now crawls ProQuest, which is the largest publisher of PhD theses, and so it's now getting indexed. Web of Science and Scopus still completely ignore theses, even though they are really scientific publications, but at least a few people are trying to make them out there. So if we look at what goes on for an academic, this is a survey from in the US, where do people spend their time? Now, to be honest, this is a survey from, I don't know, over 1,000 people, but mostly from the top 200 national universities, so not, we are now in the national university, we're not necessarily in the top 200, but we're getting there. So where do people spend their time? So people spend about half their time on good papers, about 15% of their time on teaching and mentoring, around 25% of their time on grants, 10 to 20% on community service, and 10 to 20% on good talks or networking. Okay, so and good talks and good papers, right, are well over half of what we do. And that's really about our research. Notice none of those columns says research. Why do you think research doesn't show up there? Research is applied in papers and talk. Grants are really research I'm going to do, so it's not research I've done, but it's the research shows up in good papers and good talk, right? So that's where I focus on. And yes, I'm doing research, but I'm not just doing research. I'm doing research because I'm writing papers, and the two are a very integrated part of the process. And when you get done, you're not going down this path for money. Hopefully none of you think this is the way to get rich, although you might do okay. But what you put in the literature is your scientific legacy after all else is gone, right? So long after you're done your career, if you've had papers that have really had an impact, that is your legacy. And that's one way of looking at what you do, is what legacy do you want to leave? You want to have something that's going to make a difference in the world? So if you look at it from that point of view, you want to think about looking at your papers from a distance. Not how you see the paper, not how it occurs to you, but how does it occur to everyone else? So first you want to see it as it will occur to a reviewer. Because, believe me, the reviewers are not going to look at your paper the way you look at your paper, not how your advisor looks at your paper. The reviewer will look at your paper very differently. If you imagine the papers you have read during your reading for this class, right, you probably had very different attitudes about the paper than the reader or the author did. Right? And we tried to teach you to have very different ideas. Right? We taught you to shred the paper, to be critical, go through and answer a bunch of questions. So even if you think it's great, the viewer probably won't. It's also really important in this field to understand that the best scientists get rejected and or have to make major revisions to the paper all the time. The rejection rate is tough. So if we look at Science, which is one of the top journals, 75% of the paper, or 70% of the papers, 75%, I have two different numbers, I'm not sure which is which. So the 75 is overall, get rejected before they do an in-depth review. So before it actually even goes out to the reviewers, the editors reject 75% of their papers. 18% of the papers get rejected after an in-depth review. Biological papers, about 4% get accepted, and physical science papers, about 3% get accepted. The numbers on the outside are similar, but they are for Nature. So two top journals, and they behave pretty much the same, right? So the odds of being rejected are what? 93%, right? At these journals of the papers get accepted. So, and to be honest, that number might even be artificially low. Why do you think the number could actually be much higher? Why is it that really more than 97% of papers would be rejected by science?
Some of them aren't. Like, I mean, you might start out writing a paper for it, but then you self-reject.
Yep.
So that's part of it.
So that's an important thing. When we look at rejection rates, the rejection rates are out of the pool of people that thought it was good enough to even try. Right? I have yet to submit a paper to science. Right? I haven't had anything that I thought was both in the right venue kinds of stuff that they look at and good enough to go to science and not already published. Right? So I publish it someplace else, I'm not going to bother with science. So this self-selection rate is very important because some of the really good and also really tough conferences only have like a 20% acceptance rate. So CVPR is very aggressive. NeurIPS is very aggressive. SIGGRAPH is very aggressive. Right? But their acceptance rates are actually all around 20%. Why? Because at a certain point, people just stop trying. Right? This paper, and my students have this conversation all the time, this isn't even good enough to try. You'd just be wasting 6 months and a bunch of reviewers' time to go down this path, because I tell you, it's not going to get in, we're not going to try. We still submit ones that probably won't get in, but they have a prayer, right? If we win the reviewer lottery, this can get in, right? But other ones, I can't imagine a reviewer lottery we get. So even when you look at them, you want to be careful to look at what those statistics mean to you, because it's not a truly random process because of the self-selection. So when you want to look at people, right, and similarly, when people look at you, how do people evaluate people based on their publications? So, of course, publications are not the only criteria to be considered. When we're looking at people for hiring, publications are not the only thing we look at, but they're among the most important things we look at. There are a few other things we look at. But if they don't have the publications, nothing else matters. Right? So I would consider publications to be if you have this, you're in the ballpark, and now we'll look at a whole bunch of other things. But people who apply, so we may evaluate, I think last year, I don't know, 100 and some candidates, right? There are a whole bunch of people where like they have 4 publications and not very good venues. That's it. We never even discuss them, right? The entire process is faculty members go through a ranking, and if their publication records are too weak, they don't even get to the point of being discussed among multiple people. 2 people look at them, they said they were this week, they have a number, we're done. We don't go through the process. because they don't meet our criterion for what we're looking for. So quantity versus quality. In fact, 3 or 4 for a PhD student, and 3 or 4, it depends on where those 3 or 4 are. 3 or 4 in a tier 1 venue, and you're in the discussion area. 3 or 4 in tier 3 venues, you're not in the category, right? So you can't just go by quantity, and you can't just go by quality, right? But our committee will use both of those numbers in some way that gets put together. Quantity is, however, self-referential. It doesn't lead to the ultimate goal, but multiple research studies have shown that more papers almost always produce better papers. Not always, but most of the time it does. If you look at people who have had really significant papers, most of the really significant papers came at a time of high productivity. There are people that say, no, I'm going to focus and I'm just going to do one good paper. Problem is, it's really hard to say what's one good paper. If you have one good idea, and that's the only thing you can work on, but if you have 3, you don't know which one of those is going to turn out to be a significant one for other people. You know what you think it is, right? But there's a balance, right? And if you're senior enough and you've got all this years of experience that you can look and say, that one's significant and that one's not, you probably have already been publishing so much, you're just going to keep publishing a lot anyhow. It doesn't matter. You'll publish the good one and the one and see where it goes. And as I said, I think I've already shared with you, right? One of my top 3 papers in terms of citations is a paper I thought was junk and published in a junk venue, and now it's got 300 and some citations, right? So I don't pretend to be good at answering the question, is it junk? There's lots of times when I can look at it and say, yeah, it's not very good, but this is why I will let my students sometimes submit. We'll encourage them to submit all kinds of stuff, but you'll see where it goes.
Like, I mean, so obviously starting to structure your research and starting to write your paper at the same time is a good idea. Do you normally structure it with like the targeted formatting associated with whatever venue you think that it might be going to, or?
Yes and
Okay.
no. So I always start with the first venue I think it's going to go to.
There you go. Yeah.
The venue it goes to might be different, right? Because
Right.
2 things can happen. We can be aiming for a particular deadline. We start in that format and then we don't hit the deadline. Or we hit the deadline and it doesn't get in and then gets revised. So you can go either way. To me, I mean, after a certain amount of time with LaTeX, like the difference between this conference template and that conference template, not a big deal.
I have a research paper on
The
LaTeX
page
that you
count
can read.
is usually different. The page count.
Well, so that's what I was going to say. It's like,
Yeah.
so
It's a
the,
lot
for,
different.
the formatting is not so big a difference. But if one's a 4-page conference and one is an 8-page conference, that's a huge difference. And so
8 pages includes the bibliography. Yeah.
8 pages including the bibliography or 8 pages without the bibliography, there's lots of differences in terms of how much you can write. But if I'm aiming for a 4-page conference, which I rarely aim for, those are normally where things go after they've died at the other ones.
You only need 4 pages to talk about your research.
Well, if they've already told you that there really isn't much novel here, then you can reduce it down to 4 pages. But every now and then I've done a couple of 4-page papers where it's like it's a small, simple idea. It's not worth 8 pages. I'm not going to elaborate to that. Then I choose a venue like that and I go for it. Right? So choosing a venue, which we'll talk a little bit more about, is also shaped by how big is the idea, what is it going to take to think about. So the 2 are related. Sometimes the venue chooses how much I'm going to put in the paper. Other times the ideas choose what venue we go after. So it goes both ways. So when you're looking at publications, right, publications are not the only criterion. In fact, I already did this slide. Oh, I see. I added a bullet. What the heck was I doing? Okay, so I'll add some more. The default rating. So for most of you, there's 2, and I apologize for the bad formatting, but when people go to look at your papers, there are 2 ways to evaluate the quality of a paper. One, if the paper's old enough, is to look at its citations. But for a paper that's only a year or 2 old, that's very hard to do. So way more often, they're going to look at the default rating of your place based on where the publication, what was the venue you put it in, right? And that's where your publication strategy becomes important. The part we're going to talk about today is a little bit about that strategy. So you have to know, where am I going to send it? So the role of the publication venue is, well, the work has to be good, but if I publish it in a less well-known place, it may not get the reputation it deserves because of where it's published. So one of my students and I had a really good paper on adversarial attacks, but we published it in a biometrics conference because we were actually attacking real face recognition system. For us, it was about the face recognition. And lots of the people in the space of adversarial stuff have completely ignored the paper because they don't read biometrics conferences, and so they never see it, right? But for us, it was like, not only is it an attack, it's an attack against a real system that really works, and so we wanted that community to know about it. But you choose the wrong place, and yes, it had been rejected from someplace else, but that was got to find a balance.
AI sec paper.
AI stats?
There's a new conference called AI sec.
Oh, sec, okay.
Which is based on the whole adversarial machine learning attacking algorithms.
Yeah, so don't know that one. Can't tell you anything about it.
It's
so
new.
It's new. Well, yeah, but new. So
New
like,
is not necessarily good.
news not necessarily good. News not necessarily bad. A lot depends on who are the organizers. So ICLR, which is a relatively recently new conference, right, was
International conference
on learning representations. So I think it started in 2014 or 15. Can't remember. It's only a couple years old. But the people who were the original founders were like Jan LeCun and Bengio, right? These are really big names in the machine learning space. And they said, we're going to go make a new conference. It took them a while to get their act together, but it now is a well-respected conference, right? They also had some very, this will be on the internet, they had some very non-traditional models for how to do publication. So in the first 2 or 3 years, so they don't publish any proceedings. The papers only exist in archive, in no organized fashion in archive. And the reviewing for the first 2 years was through a system called Open Review, where the papers are public, the reviews are public, and caused very different from, and the review was like, everything should be public. Then they tried a year where nothing was public. This year it's half public.
So they're like dialing in their transparency.
They're trying to figure out, like, yeah, what's the right balance? Because when everything was public, I refused to submit. Because, well, it's not good. The problem with a public, fully open review system is that if you submit a paper and it gets trashed in a public venue, it is going to be very hard to publish that paper anywhere, ever, because the reviewers will find that version and look at it through the filtered eyes of, it was already rejected, what's going on, right? So that just puts you down one step as soon as you've been there. But in the world where things are going in archive, you're already getting beaten up a little bit. So there's this interesting balance we're trying to do. Part of their goal was good. They wanted people to see real reviews. But because their system was an open review, anybody could publicly comment on your paper. You also got lots of comments that were not always the most well-focused. But now they're out there about what's going on. So it was an odd experiment. So new conferences can actually be really interesting venues. They can run lots of experiments, and we like to run experiments.
The authors' names were not blinded.
No, authors' names were not blinded. So you know exactly who the authors were. Even in their first version, I have to be careful. It still had one part that was blind. The names of the reviewers were blind, which is sometimes called single blind review.
It should be double.
I prefer double blind, but in the world of archive, double blind is really tough, because if I go looking for the paper and I find an archive, I already know who the authors are, right? So to be honest, right, from a strategy point of view, right, my students and I have active conversations. We've submitted a paper. Should it be on archive or not? Right? It comes down to our choice. If we put it on archive, we run the risk that people will know it's us, which could be bad, or it could be good. So it becomes a strategy question. You can play, if it's double blind and archive, you have a choice.
I was going to say, I know certain labs can get their papers into a lot of conferences, really without question, because of who the lab is.
Right, so
It's not unheard of.
right, so you have the right connections to people, right? So our conference, so CVPR, the conference I help run, we actually have a moratorium. If you tweet about your paper is rejected. Right? Before it gets in, so you can't have publicity for your paper. It can be on archive, but you can't be out actively trying to publicize it. Right. And then we got ourselves into trouble. Well, what happens if somebody else tweets about your paper? Okay. Now, how far do you get on that path? Right? Can I get your paper rejected by tweeting about your paper? So there's a whole bunch of strategies. Right?
It's like a denial of service for
Yeah. So we didn't realize how negative our community could quickly become. And so there's a whole bunch of strategy questions, right? So now we try to be a little bit more, like, if somebody tweets about, during the review process, we're actually not going to reject the paper because it was tweeted about, because that becomes denial of service. But if the paper was marked for exception and the people are out actively advertising it before the conference and whatever, then we can withdraw the paper and say, nope, it's been withdrawn.
I really find archive fascinating because not only do you get like the early draft of the paper, but usually they'll update it based on the reviewers for the journals.
Yeah.
And then additionally, if they find stuff that was
Wrong.
wrong
Oh, yes,
incorrect,
errata,
it's
yeah. Yeah. So,
brilliant.
in fact, our conference is using archive as our errata mechanism, right? So it's like, if you have an errata in your paper, CVPR will on their website put a link to your updated archive paper, but we keep the original, right? So it's like, this is what was published, but here's where you go to find the other stuff. Yeah, so, and we are literally trying to pay Cornell Archive, which is the group that does it at Cornell, to introduce an anonymous archive submission, which is, to us will solve the, we want it out, but we want to maintain double-blind submission. And so we've had many internal discussions about a process by which, first, it's a lot of work, so we're going to pay them, but that's fine, we'll give them the money. But we want them to have something where you can submit a paper, and for up to 12 months, it will mean anonymous, but you can't change the version that was submitted. The paper's out there, it's just anonymous, it's got an archive number. People can still cite it just without as the anonymous archive. And then eventually, no matter what you do, after a year, it becomes public. So you have 1 year to publish it anonymously. After that, it becomes a public paper. You have to deal with it. But the tier 1 conferences, it gives you generally 2 bites at conferences to get it in there, right? So it gets rejected. You can try one more time, and then after that, you're probably down to tier 2 conferences anyhow, and they'll just do with the archive issue. Whether or not it's a year, that's actually part of the big discussions. Or people, it's like maybe should be allowed to go 18 months, 24. It's like there's a whole big. But the whole idea of making archive, but also solving the anonymous problem, this is an interesting direction to go. So I think I skipped over. So archival journals, top conferences, specialized workshops, right? Lots of these are places where you have to decide where you want things to go, right? And so you'll have to look at those and figure out what's going to go on. So in every conference, in every area you're going to look at, right, there's some question of what is your domain knowledge for your area. This is the best discussion with your advisor, though a little bit of Google Scholar stuff and index metrics can help you understand what's a good venue and what's not. So each area has the top conferences and more focused symposium workshop. Conferences, symposium workshops are places where you can meet with your peers, become part of the community, and start to get your work known. So this is a common trade-off, right? You don't get into the tier 1 conference. In my field, for the last 10, 15 years, right, we've had co-located workshops at our conferences. So if you don't make it in the main conference, the deadline for workshops is going later, and a lot of the papers get reworked and submitted to a much more focused workshop. Or we have standalone workshops or smaller conferences where you can just apply to. Both of those become opportunity venues. For PhD students, one of the things you have to worry about for any of those is the costs. Conference symposium workshops require shorter papers than journals. They generally require that you register and travel, which makes them more expensive. Journals, if you do a lot of the journals right, they are free. If you go over, you pay page charges, but you can submit to journals, right, and it doesn't cost you anything but time. They tend to be less complete papers, less mature than journal papers, but they almost always have a shorter and more predictable turnaround time. That's almost always now, because there are some journals that have pretty fast turnaround times if you understand their cycles. I've had papers published in PAMI submitting in October or November and having them published by May. Right? So about the same amount of time as if I submitted to CVPR in November, which is in June, right? So a 9-month cycle. Some journals, so Science and Nature actually have a pretty fast cycle, but that's just because they adjust most of it without ever having it reviewed. IEEE has a journal called Access, which is very broad, and IEEE Access has a very fast turnaround time. So there's a couple of journals that are trying to go after the fact that they were beaten up for having too long. Right? JMLR, one of the machine learning conferences, has a little over 2 years as average rate. And this is true for a number of journals, even in computer science. What they tend to be is, here is the conference version of the paper, and then it's an expanded version that gets published in those journals. It's actually harder to get those in than if you submit directly to the journal. Your chances of getting a paper into PAMI, if it was a revised conference paper, the acceptance rate is around 15%. Direct submission is around 25%. But that's because there's more novelty in a paper that's never been published someplace else, and it's easier for the reviewers to say, this is novel and important. Conference papers, a lot of them are, they took the conference paper, they slapped a few more experiments in, and it really isn't that much novel, and so it's easier to say, there really isn't enough here to make it a paper. So for your strategy, you want to understand the venues you're going to try and conferences. Aim at covering both journals and conference, symposium, and workshops. And that's because they have different roles. Journal papers are bigger, they're longer. They're actually a good place for survey papers because journals that accept survey papers, right? Lots of conferences don't. You have no choice to submit them. So if you're going to do a survey paper, you might want to look at them. Some conferences do allow them, then it would be okay. The goal for symposium and workshops are for you to get out there and start getting your relationship with people and to get some early publications. A publication in a tier 3 workshop is still better than no publications. Okay? A publication in a crap journal, however, may be worse than no publications. We'll come back to that. Because there's no real value to you to publish in a predatory journal. It looks bad. It looks like you don't know what's going on. You can publish in a workshop because you want to go meet people, right? And for networking, it's a great event, even if I don't go. In lots of places, you can't go unless you have a university or a company won't pay for you to go unless you have a paper. So having a paper is a reason to go.
So what is the format for workshops? Are they just like the posters and?
So workshop formats depend radically on the workshop. They're all over the place. There are workshops that are mostly invited speakers and posters, and they may or may not publish. So you can have a paper or a workshop that doesn't publish. It doesn't count as a publication, but you get to give a presentation, a poster, mingle with people. As I think I mentioned before, a number of workshops do these 4-page extended abstracts because lots of places don't count 4 pages as published, so you can republish it someplace else, but you want to get the word out and start talking to people. And it's a great way of getting good feedback on your work early. And then there are workshops that are straight up mini conferences, right? They are a workshop, they publish, they have papers, oral presentations. So in IEEE, as an overall arching society, their general rules are you're a conference if you're above 300, you're a symposium if you're between 300 and 150, and you're a workshop if you're under 150 attendees.
Otherwise, it's the same.
Otherwise, it can be the same, right? So you can actually have conferences that don't publish. There are very few, right? But you have a conference that is largely about industry interaction, right? So we still can call it a conference. Most symposiums do publish, but lots of them are largely invited speakers. And the same is true with workshops, which are, we have plenty of workshops in our field that are all invited speakers and no publications. So there's a balance all over the place. So I recommend an incremental strategy for your work, where you have an early notification of your work, early feedback. Start with workshop papers, or you go for the tier 1 venues. This is the advantage of archive, is you can get stuff out of archive and get some feedback. You tend to never get feedback unless you ask for it, though. If you just put a paper on archive, it will just sit there, right? If you put it on archive and you send mail to people who might be interested and ask them for feedback, then you might get some feedback, right? If you send mail to the people you cited and say, I found your work interesting, I thought you might find this interesting, letting you know, looking for feedback on a student, you'd be surprised. You might get 1 or 2 that will feedback. Out of like 20, but it's still feedback. My view, absolutely, never republish the same material. I don't, and this is more controversial. Lots of people say publish at a conference and then turn around to a journal. And I believe if you want more citations, that is fine. If your advisor pushes you to do it, it's normal. Lots of people do it. Okay. But if you're going to go for a journal, they're going to require 20 to 30% new material that wasn't in the original conference paper, and I'll show you an example of that. Right? That's their minimum. So you got to add 20 to 30%. And some people will talk about. I'll talk a little bit more about some of the ethical issues later. But you really want to avoid what we call the LPU, the least publishable unit syndrome. Your goal is not to find how do I chop my work into the smallest number of pieces to get the most number of papers. Right? Now there's definitely a trend towards that, and various people will go down this path. But republishing the same material in 2 different venues, in my view, is acceptable under 2 conditions. The first condition is there really are different venues. So if I publish something that, and I'll take maybe the vehicle space, right? If I published in an IEEE vehicle symposium and another in Usenix security, right? That'd be perfectly fine if it's the same area, because those 2 groups don't necessarily read each other, right? So you're talking about how they interact, right? And one should be more focused on the vehicle parts and one more the pure security parts, but it might be the same work presented 2 very different ways, right? That's 2 different papers based on the core research, but it's not the same paper. So when I say the same material, right, I'm not saying don't publish about the research twice, but it's don't publish the same material twice, right, the same core paper. The other reason you might do it is if you get invited or you choose to do the conference paper journal where you add 20, 30, 40% more material to it. Okay? Now, the reason I don't push my students to do this, and I've never practiced this much in my career, is I have conference papers or journal papers. I don't think I have any that I've ever taken a conference paper and converted to a journal. But my view is, like, what new things did I add to the world by doing that, right? If I really did some new, bigger experiments, I might consider doing that. I'm fruit fly. I've got to hop around into the problem. So I've already moved on, but beyond that. But the other is, if I think it's going to be that big, I'll just go straight to the journal, right? Skip the comments. You can go both ways. And by the time you add enough added material, it's a lot of work. So it's new material, and it's not the same material. It might have something in common in trying to do it. But when I have done things that are related between conference and journal, the conference paper and the journal paper have almost no overlap, except for the idea. The journal paper starts from where the conference paper ended. So I can add 20 or 30% and try and reuse the same material, or I can basically cite and have a little bit of an introduction that says, go read the conference paper and now start from there. Right? And I find if I'm going to have a journal paper, since I have a choice in journal papers between 8 and 14 pages, I can take the 8-page conference paper and try and add stuff to get to 14. Or I can just assume the conference paper exists, add some stuff as the intro, and now I have an 8-page paper. And it turns out that it's easier to get the 8-page papers accepted than the 14s, because journals have an actual absolute limit on their paper page count. I know it's archaic, but they still publish them on paper, right? And so they pay per page, and so you want to get that into your consideration. So in my view, I don't recommend republishing the same material. Just take the follow-on idea and expand on it, make that a new paper, maybe a little bit shorter. I think I've already talked a little bit about this, but I'm going to go in a lot more detail today about the peer review process. So paper submission, the paper goes to reviewers are collected, and either a decision is made or you go back and get to revise the paper and maybe get to iterate. We'll go through a couple examples of this. So the whole goal of peer review is aiming at assuring quality. And quality has a broad definition for the venue. Because a paper that is really, really good, but in the wrong venue, should still not necessarily be accepted. If I take a paper, and we've actually had a paper at one of the conferences I've run, where everyone said, this is an amazing and novel paper, but it doesn't belong in this conference, right? Everyone loved the paper. It just said it wasn't in our field, right? So you got to send it someplace else. And that can be very tricky if you're between fields or dealing with things, because you have to figure out where to really send it. So, so the quality depends on the venue, and different thresholds, both what's the topic and the quality is what's going to look at. Before you submit anywhere, you want to carefully read the requirements specified in the journal, conference, website, or whatever, and comply with them. Satisfying time constraints, formatting, length, right? CBPR rejects something like 2 to 3% of the submissions because they simply didn't follow the directions. They never get to the reviewers because their name is on the page, it's too long, the margins are wrong, right? And that's really quick to just quickly go through papers, and when they're assigning the papers to people, they look at them, and sometimes they don't. Sometimes they assign them to you, and then a week later they get withdrawn because somebody says that paper is not following right formats, and that's it. All of the reviewers really love to reject papers by not reading them. They didn't follow the rules, I've rejected them. I can save myself half a day. I'm going to do it every time. So it's a voluntary job, right? We don't get paid for it. So you want to help them and recognize that they are volunteering their time and they have a lot of this to do. So you want to help them help you. You want to make it very clear what's the stuff they're looking for. I'll come back to that in a second. So don't give them an easy way to reject your work. Submit your best and final version. Right? But there's lots of things that you have to look at, and we'll go through some of the review forms. Understanding what the reviews look like might change how you write your paper. You'll see why. So you want them to provide useful feedback, which is only possible for journals or for conferences that have either a 2-stage review process or at least a rebuttal session. Right? So you want them to make your paper better. But realistically, in my view, you always want them to give you feedback on how to make the paper better. Because if it doesn't get in, you're going to submit it someplace else and you want to fix it. If it does get in, you want to fix those things before the paper gets there. And recognizing it that they have a voluntary job and they're doing this under time constraints, if you have lots of small errors, they're probably not going to get to them if you also have some big errors, right? And oddly enough, if you have lots of small errors, they may not even get to the big ones because they may get stuck depending on their style of reading and commenting. They get stuck dealing with these small things and never even mention the giant horse, the giant elephant in the room, because they tripped over so many little things. They didn't even get to the big picture because they're stuck on it. So as you know, I'm dyslexic, and so I struggle with this problem. But I can guarantee you, if you get a paper that's got 25 misspellings and grammatical errors in the first page, your reviewers will often miss the big hole in your paper because at this point in time, you've lost credibility and they're sort of done. They're not going to skim really fast, right? So you're not going to get the same level of review. So you want to make sure all that's done. And I have no idea why this next slide is coming up next. I think I got them out of order, but we'll come up with it. So, so a little bit about some of the ethics stuff. Oh, on this one, because it's about that piece. When you're writing your papers, there's a bunch of rules. Right? One of them is almost no conference that's worth submitting to allows double submissions or journal. Right? Basically, you can have this paper under review in one place at one point in time. And if you have another paper that is sufficiently similar, don't submit it anywhere until you get this feedback. Right? Don't submit a paper to a journal until the conference paper subsumes the journal as presented. This is a little tricky. Is it presented or accepted? But my recommendation is you don't submit it until it's been presented, or at least really close to being presented. So if your conference makes a decision in February, you don't turn around and submit the paper in June, or the paper in April or May, right? You wait until June. I, as an editor of a journal, that I see that happen, where they've submitted the journal version before they even presented it at the conference, will almost always desk reject it because they haven't had time to get the advanced work, right, to build on it and gotten feedback from the work they presented. What they have then at that point in time is 3 reviews from the reviewers, right? That's not enough to say, okay, here's how we're going to build upon and expand the work, right? And so it's often like resubmit it as new after you've gotten the feedback.
But CDPR automatically submits to the Access Journal a lot of the conferences do.
Nope. So Access is a particular journal. CDPR and a lot of IEEE conferences all have their papers automatically included in IEEE Explore.
Okay. Got it.
Explore is their online digital library. So yes, all of our papers show up in there,
Okay.
Which is different than showing up in journal. Now, some conferences like SIGGRAPH, a paper in SIGGRAPH is a paper in TOG, the transactions on graphics, right? So there are some that are tight inside. And obviously then it's not a problem if they have an automatic system. The problem is when people say, well, the paper's been accepted, I'm going to submit it now to a journal because I want to deal with that buffer of time, right? It just, the whole point is to let the paper mature a little bit and get a little bit more feedback. But if you do double submit, almost every conference and journal I know, if they detect a double submission, you are instantly rejected from both of them. Not like I get to pick one, I get rejected from one, no. And the group that tends to review your paper tends to be a smaller group than you might think. And so if one of them says, and I've seen this many times where it's like, I am reviewing that paper for another conference. That's it, you get done, you're automatically rejected. Some conferences will effectively blacklist you. Not only will your paper be rejected, but because this was an ethical violation, they're going to reject more of your papers, not just these 2. We detected these 2, but you might have had a lot more. So maybe we're just going to say no to the rest of your papers for a while. IEEE, official IEEE policy only allows us to blacklist people for plagiarism, right? But we have successfully argued that submitting 2 papers to the same conference against a double submission counts as plagiarism. We don't even know who the other paper is. It's like you submitted the same paper because they have different author sublets, right? But it includes yourself. But anyhow, we can view, if we view that as plagiarism, then we can invoke IEEE's rules and blacklist you for 5 years. Hasn't happened very often, but we had one person who was very egregious. So.
Is it considered plagiarism to submit an article based on master's thesis?
So is it plagiarism? No. If it's properly cited. If you don't cite it, it's considered plagiarism. Right? So if you're giving citations to the right source and it is your own work, now it is tricky, depending on what happened with your master's thesis. If your master's thesis gets picked up by a publisher other than ProQuest, so ProQuest's rule is, this is ours, but you, the author, maintain the copyright. Right? So if you own the copyright, you have the right to reuse that material and assign it to anybody else. because it's your work. If it's published by Springer, now Springer owns the copyright to those drawings and figures and whatever. You have to get their permission to reuse them in your own publications. Right, so you get this weird structure that can go.
Why does Springer get that right? Is it because it's pretty to look at?
No, because you gave it to them.
IEEE gets it too.
IEEE gets it when you publish it in a conference paper. So when you publish, there's a form where you're assigning your copyright from me to them. Now, it turns out that whole copyright thing is complicated because you own the original copyright. You gave them the right to use this in this publication. But that means you're limited in what you can do with your original copy. So I can put it on archive, I can do a bunch of other things with it because they're within IEEE rules. IEEE basically says you can do that. But what IEEE won't let you do is go publish the same thing in Springer. Right? Because now there's a competing commercial interest. Right? And that's the whole point of copyright laws. No, we own this. You want that copy, you come to us, not go to them.
So how does Springer's differ from that?
Springer's is a little bit more aggressive on what you can do with your own personal copy. Springer basically says, you've given us exclusive rights, and that's the one word that shows up, which means I cannot put it in archive without violating Springer's terms and conditions. Now, realistically, you will find a whole bunch of them that are in archive and then show up in Springer. So the temporal order of that is very important. You already put a copy in archive, right? Now, you're going to put, and it's not the same version, you're going to put a slightly different version in Springer. And Springer accepts the fact that it was there first. They have to accept it, right? So as long as you cited the other one, because that makes them aware that that version exists. And then they can decide, look, we're not going to take this because you already published it in your thesis, or we're not going to publish it because it's an archive. They can make an informed decision. If you hide that information from them, then they legally can actually come back after you because you didn't tell them about this other version you already given out. So their license is worth less. Realistically, they're not going to come after you for most of that kind of stuff. Far more bigger problem is if you include an image of Disney characters in your paper, Disney's coming after you. Right? Because there's a whole bunch of other copyright issues. You have to have the right to use it and make sure it's okay. There's a fair use clause, a whole bunch of things which we'll probably talk about later in the semester, but for now let's go back to. Anyhow, a couple other ethical things I don't think I should have to say, but I would like to make sure we do cover them, which is never report data facts that are unsubstantiated. Right? Now, if they're unsubstantiated, don't report them as data or facts. You can say, we believe. Right? You have now prefaced it. Now, this is odd because normally anything you write in your paper is your belief. But from a practical point of view, if you say, right, the fact is law, right, that's not we believe the fact is, right? Beliefs and facts, as a scientist, are supposed to be separated. Beliefs are things that you know are not yet substantiated. So if you run an experiment, right, and the graph says the performance growth is quadratic, that's a fact. If you say, we believe it's because of this feature, right, and you've limited it, we don't have an experiment to show it. So you want to be careful how you present that. That's a little bit more. Obviously, never report work done by others as yours. Right? Again, shouldn't have to say this, but apparently it shows up. The biggest thing I think where people do see some of that is where we hope it's not intentional, but the way in which you present somebody else's work makes it come across as though it's yours. That's problematic. But I've had a PhD student who copied large sections from another paper without telling me, right, and presented it because he liked the way it was phrased. He said, they had a good description of this, so I just reused it. It's like, sorry, that's not the way things work, so I want to be very clear. You don't copy paragraphs from other papers and reuse it. Now, if you go into archive and you find somebody's math that you like, right, and you get their LaTeX and you reuse bits of it, and you've cited their paper, it's a fine. If you don't cite their paper, it's not fine. Right? So citations give you a way of taking bits and pieces of other people's work and reusing them. Ethically, don't live in isolation. There's really just no justification for ignoring previous work or history in the field. And in general, it will bite you way more often than it will benefit you to ignore somebody. Because it only takes one reviewer that says, you ignored this important piece of work and your paper is in serious jeopardy because of that, right? Whereas if you cite it, and it's there, right? Yes, it might not be novel, but the worst thing you do is not even have somebody say, you forgot to cite this person, but this work is a duplication of that work, you're done. There's no recovering from those reviews. So give proper credit to previous work and contextualize your work. If your work is very similar, you are the best person to say how is it different and why is it better. And if you can't tell us that, don't expect the reviewers to invent it, right? And chances are really good. In fields that do a good job of assigning papers, your paper might go to somebody who really knows what's going on. We actually use automated software now to help make that matching better, but not all fields do. And when you're a referee, don't reject a paper simply because it didn't refer to one of your minor papers, right, or one of your papers. But if the work is really similar and it should have cited it, that might still be a reason to bring it up and make them try and address it, at least make them aware of it. And when writing reviews, that's always a tricky space. If you write a review that says, you know, you missed this paper by Bolt, and this paper by Bolt, and this paper by Bolt, who is the reviewer? Bolt, right? So you want to find a balance, one, so that you don't give it away, but also you want to choose like the most important mistake they made. Yes, you might have 2 or 3 papers that are relevant, but you really only want to hit the one that's the most significant that calls their work into question. Take reviews when you're doing them and when you're getting them seriously. I think I told this before. Treat them like gold. Peer reviews are fundamental to improve the scientific work, both as a reviewer and as a reviewee. If you ignore them, and it's painful when people beat you up, but step back, go talk to somebody else like, you know, this is what the review is telling you, how do I fix my paper to make it happen? Help the community as a reviewer. You may say no, but more often you should say yes if you get asked. If you want to be a reviewer, talk to your advisor. They might be able to get you to be a reviewer. For almost all of my students, I go through a process where the first time they're not a reviewer, I get permission. So many of our conferences actually have, they sign the paper to somebody, and they can have somebody else who works in the review as well. There's literally a line at the bottom of the form that says, this paper was actually reviewed by, right, even though my name is the person who the review went to. I do that all the time. With my first time I'd work with students, I will give them a copy of the paper, I will do my own review, and then I will go through the reviews with them, and we'll sort of talk about what that is. I do know other people who pretty much just assign them to students and never look at them. Not the best way, but it happens. So you have to take that into consideration when you get reviews. Even if the review might have come from a big name, it might have come from the student of a big name, not the big name itself. So there's a balance with this. But if you get a chance to review, I strongly recommend you take up that chance right now, early in your career. You'll learn a whole lot more about the process sitting inside than seeing it from the outside. Okay? You may not like how the sausage is made, but sometimes it's good to know what's going on inside that sausage. And so if you can, get a chance. So I'm going to go through a couple of quick review forms just so you can get them. They're going to be a little bit small, so hopefully you'll be able to read them, but the forms are designed to be multiple pages, right? So this is a form from one of the IEEE journals. So like there's a reader interest, right? Which category best describes this? Practical, research, survey. Please explain your how relevant is this, right? So, you know, if you get down to interesting but not relevant or irrelevant, you know, you're sort of done. The paper's not probably going to get very far. One longer question, explain how this manuscript advances the field of research and contributes. This is like a text box, you fill in some stuff. Is the manuscript technically sound? Yes, appears to be. Partially, no. No is a bad place to be. Partially is also a bad place to be. Generally, partially you have a chance to fix it. No, your paper's probably just rejected. Appears to be, but didn't check completely. What do you think that means to you when you get it back as a reviewer, as an author? If your paper comes back with appears to be, but didn't check completely.
It means that either the math that I included was so opaque that somebody legitimately couldn't interpret it. Just doing a cursory review, I perhaps should consider something less opaque.
So that's one possibility. Anything else?
The reviewer is not in the same.
Right, so it's possible that they're not in the same field. Chances are for journals that probably are in the same field, but there's another thing, which is
Density was accepted or rejected. Based on that, you can make your own judgment.
So what do you mean by it depends if it was accepted or rejected?
Like whether the submission was accepted or rejected completely, and also whether it was accepted or rejected by this particular reviewer.
Yeah, so the micro recognition. So part of what you're saying is actually, if the reviewer said accept, and then they've checked off appears to be but didn't check completely, right? It might be they trust that you did the math right, and so they're not going to go through it in great detail. Could be, as Mann said, that they're just not comfortable checking all the math, right? The other is that, in fact, the paper had so many other problems that they didn't bother checking the math, right? So it depends on, so the answer is, it depends a lot on the other parts of you have to understand what it is. But the one thing you know about it, if they check that box, is they didn't feel it was worth their time to read your math. Whether it's because of the way you presented the math, whether because the paper was already good enough that they were accepting it, or because it was bad enough, right? They didn't check the math, which also means if there's another problem, you're going to have to deal with it someplace else. Some of these, I'm not even sure whether they ask the question, are the titles, abstracts, and keywords appropriate? Yes, and there's room for us to comment. So if they don't like your title, they will complain about it here. Does the manuscript contain sufficient references? And again, there's room to put them in. Important references are missing, more references are needed. Generally, they will tell you this. Some journals, so PAMI, TBio, IGSV, all the journals I've been an editor for, we actually don't allow somebody to click this box and not give us the names of actual papers, right? They can't say important references are missing and not tell you which ones. Right? It's not my job as an editor to figure them out. It's not your job as an author to figure out which ones are missing if so no one told you. So as an editor, I would go back and say, no, fill this in. Conferences, like even CVPR, we make them fill that in. The last box, number of references are excessive. We don't make them tell you which ones are excessive. We just look and say, they had 65. That's too many, right? They didn't need all of them, right? Because in fact, they just look at them. It's like, I noticed a whole bunch of these and a whole bunch aren't relevant, so they'll be in there. Does the introduction state the objectives of the manuscript in terms that encourage the reader to read on? Right? This is literally one of the questions, right? Does this introduction make you want to keep reading? With the organization, how would you rate the organization? Is it focused? Is the length appropriate? Please comment. So, poor could be improved, and then we make you comment on what the organizational stuff is. Please rate the comment on the readability of this manuscript. So we're like through half their questions. Do you notice anything particular about these questions?
Multiple guess.
Well, they're multiple guess plus a comment, right? But what are they talking about the actual assignments? You'll notice a lot of these questions are about presentation, right? Not about the course science. There was a question, how relevant, right, is this to the, and is it technically sound, right? Those were actually, early questions, but a lot of the questions are these more presentational questions. Summary and evaluation, so rate the quality of the paper, and then make a recommendation. Authors should report a major revision, revise as a regular paper. It's not uncommon for a paper to come in as a regular length and then be asked to revise as a short paper, get rid of the extraneous material, stuff like that. This is a particular set. Sometimes there's another line which is reject, resubmit as new, which is, and this has become a more common thing to add. So we want to encourage you to come back, but we know it's going to take so long, and we are very worried about what our acceptance timeline looks like. So we're not going to give you a year to fix it and another 6 months to review it, because that makes our acceptance rate look like 2 years and it's bad. So JMLR decided that because their reputation became bad because it was taking so long, they just decided that they're going to pretty much reject and resubmit as new almost all the papers instead of giving them major revisions. And they were able to reduce their time to acceptance down to around a year with an average of 4 rejections beforehand. But so they still go through it. And then some detailed comments. So honestly, in these detailed comment sections, and there can be detailed comments that are public, they go to the authors, as well as comments to the editors. These are not available to the authors. So as a reviewer, I write comments, and I regularly write comments that the authors never see. These are comments to the program chair, the area chair, the journal editor. And some of those comments are things that, like, if I think this paper might have too significant overlap with a particular paper, from a plagiarism point of view, this conference paper, whatever, is too much of an overlap, I will point that out to the editor, but I won't point that out to the author. Right? Because it's insulting to get a review that says you plagiarized this paper. Right? And it's not my job to formally test it for plagiarism. Actually, it has tools for that. The tools will catch lots of stuff, but they don't always catch it. So by my pointing it out to the editors, they can go check that out. This is also where I would put any duplicate submission. I think this is the same as CVPR submission 1265, right? And then, because I can't tell them anything else other than that, right? They can go talk to CVPR, because I don't know if the authors are the same, right? So how do I know if it really is? You don't want to tick people off. So you'd be surprised how often things show up there that are not available. Any questions on this sort of journal review stuff? Right?
Often there's also a confidence in your opinion.
I don't think of any journals that do. Conferences have it all the time.
Okay.
I'm going to do two conferences in just a second. Right? So, and that's, so journals, the editors have a lot more time to pick. To be honest, right, in this comments to the editors, if I'm not confident, that's where I would put that kind of thing. Where it would be like, you know, this paper was a stretch for me. I can tell you that the content of the paper is correct, but I really can't tell you how novel it is with respect to this stuff that I've never read. I get, unfortunately, too many journals to review for that outside of my area because I'm so broad. I have like a paper that just touched on. It's like, oh yeah, you've done cows before, well, or fish before. We'll give you a fish paper. It's like, yeah, sorry. But, okay, so in fact, I'm going to go through two different conferences just to give you a sort of feel. So that one, you notice there was a lot of check boxes and then fill in. So this is a particular conference where the first thing is a paper summary. What's this paper about? Please be concise, 2 to 3 sentences. So one of the things I said is you want to think about knowing what the reviewers have to do. How do you write your paper? So one of your hopes is that they're going to have a good summary here. Now, as a area chair for a conference, I will be annoyed if they cut and paste the abstract here, right? As an author, I will complain if they cut and paste the abstract here. But you still want to make it easy for them to summarize what the value of the paper is. So they might take 2 or 3 sentences and sort of munge them together, but it's not the whole thing. Paper strength, please discuss justifying your comments, the appropriate detail, strength of papers, novelty, theoretical approach, technical correctness, adequate evaluation, clarity. Right? So they literally have these lists of things. Well, the other one had questions, like was it clear, was it organized? Right? Here it's just free text. Paper strengths, paper weaknesses, again, lack of novelty, references, lack of novelty, technical errors, insufficient. Okay. The paper's asking you to put those things together. Then they have a recommendation where it's, I'm not showing it here, but it's actually the list, accept, reject, whatever. Justification, so now this is a couple of conferences have this, they have the weaknesses, weaknesses, but under the justification, they're basically saying, based on the weaknesses and whatever, give that answer. So this is actually a place, the whole goal of this was to consider it and provide constructive feedback. So these are the things that are most driving my decision, right? And this is because by the time people finish the reviews, there might be 20 things wrong in the weakness section. And in the journal, they had this section called detailed comments, right? They're not all equal. Some are really small, you know? On line 6, did you mean this word instead of that word? That's really minor, who cares, right? In fact, other conferences will have discussions and then minor comments, but they'll come together. This particular conference has a revision option. Some other conferences will have things where you basically get a feedback round, you get to do it, but here it's like, if this is not accepted in the first round, should the paper be invited? What would be considered the same? And the other is, indicate what issues should be addressed in the revised version. And then, like, is it a best case paper kind of thing? So here's another conference review form. Please summarize the main contributions and claims of the papers in your own words, right? So again, this is pretty much the same. If they can look at your contribution section at the end of your intro and find here's the bullets that tell me what to do, I can summarize that really quickly into this and understand what's going on. Is the paper of relevance? This is from an AI conference to an AI audience. Significance, are the problem approaches novel? Is the paper technically sound? Are claims well supported by theoretical analysis or experimental results? Is the paper well organized and clearly written? And then detailed comments. Questions for the authors. So this is one where there'll be a feedback section. The authors will get to answer the questions. They don't get to submit a revised version. They basically get one page to update the feedback, and then it'll go on to us, right? So, and in both of these cases, right, there's a bunch of detailed comments which are both most important and least important, and then questions for the authors become the most. This particular conference goes overboard on their scaling. Some conferences have 4 or 5. They will accept, reject, accept, weak accept, weak borderline, weak reject, and stronger reject. Sometimes they get rid of the middle borderline. They make you choose, is it more towards accept or reject? This conference went with 10, with top 5% of papers, top 15% of the papers, top 50% of accepted papers. and then trivially wrong, strong reject rate. So there's a whole range of these, right? I don't know what this conference does with their numbers, right? There are a few conferences that pretty much take the numbers, they sort things, and they only discuss the ones that are at the top. Others discuss all the papers, at least very briefly, or they at least have two people discuss them, even if it's not the whole group. So there's different models for all that. Then this is one where you see the confidence, right? Reviewer made an educated guess, knowledgeable out of the area, knowledgeable in the area, reviewer is an expert in the area. Yes, and this is visible to the reviewer. Sorry, at this conference, it's visible to the other reviewers and to the meta reviewer, but not to the authors. And one of the reasons, so in fact, for me, right, yeah, I may or may not be an expert in the field, but if it's going to the authors, no, actually, I rarely check it.
Okay.
It depends, right? If there's a lot of experts in the field, then I don't mind, right? But if there's really only 4 or 5 people that are really experts in this field, checking that box has reduced the space of who could have been the reviewer. Right? In which case, I will, in fact, because I wrote one the other day where it's like, I checked is knowledgeable in the area, and then the comment to the area chairs, the meta reviewers, my comment is, I actually am an expert, but there's so few of us that I'm saying it's right.
It's hard to be an expert in this area. It's hard to be an expert in this area.
No, actually, the area is so narrow that no one cares, so there's very few of us.
Okay.
Right?
It's
So
to avoid
niche.
doxing.
So niche.
It's in fact not even the doxing; it's the retaliation. But, I have definitely ticked off people with my review. So this is one of the other reasons I can't do open reviews, right? Because I'm dyslexic and my writing style is actually pretty distinctive. People quickly recognize. Oh yeah, I've had people walk up to me in a conference like, "You were my reviewer." It's like, yeah. It's just hard to say, but I will say that very often, if they're walking up to me at a conference and asking me that, it's probably a paper was accepted, and then it's not near as bad as those who are thinking that and the paper was rejected. So how many years have you worked in artificial intelligence? So this is visible to the other reviewers and to the meta reviewer. Again, if it went to the authors, it becomes problematic, right? So, how many people are experts and been in the field more than 15 years, right? You choose some narrow area, very few. So, but you can see why to the other reviewers, the meta reviewers, right? They're really trying to gauge how much should these other reviewers care about my review, right? Because if I'm a newbie, maybe they'll ignore my comments. If I'm a person who's been in the field for 15 years as an expert, maybe they should listen to what I have to say because there's something to it. I wasn't sure how to answer this question. Am I in AI or not? I don't know. My first paper from an AI conference was rejected. The review was pretty much, this is math, not AI. At which point I said, okay, now I know the difference. I will go over here. Should this paper can be considered, and then confidential comments and whatever, which again are pretty common. We're going to talk about choosing venues and stuff next, so why don't we go ahead and take a break? Hey, it's working. Be back by 10 after, if I'm going to break should be enough.
It's all trustworthy. I think there's a lot more students here, so they're more less than max.
I sent you the rough skeleton that I sent the other professor.
I got it.
Thank you. currently there is a movement towards using wireless communication in industrial control systems because it reduces cost for physical cables and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There is one protocol which is interesting, wireless hard. I don't know.
Wireless for secure, sort of for critical systems to me is a dangerous place to be. Yes, it might cost less. If I drive by a radio jammer, it could be really bad.
It could be. Yeah, and I don't know, there is already some interface between the physical system and data collection system for wireless HARP, but I do get to your concern.
You mean by heart like this or inside the car?
No, wireless HARP. It's in factories, manufacturing plants. Yeah, HARP. That would be like application of IoT, but not quite IIoT for the hard stuff.
Yeah. Most pacemakers or most heart assist devices have a network interface, or sorry, a wireless interface, because you can't have wires coming through your chest all the time. But they talk generally very simple protocol. But if you try to make like the heart of my vehicle, there's actually a growing problem for vehicles because a number of trucks are driving around with broad spectrum radio jammers in them, so that their GPSs can't track where they are. Speeding.
That's a big part of it.
Yeah, so oddly enough, speeding and not driving. Right? So some of them will drive way faster than they should, and then stop off at a place they shouldn't really stop off at for a couple of hours. Right? Well, to sleep or to do other things, right?
Sure,
And
that's
then,
fair.
so they're doing all kinds of behaviors. But the easiest way to do that is basically build a giant broad spectrum jammer, which you can make out of any microwave. Right? So anybody who wants to jam all the radios in a quarter mile around themselves can easily do so. But it would be very bad if they were to do that. And so they drive by and your radio doesn't work, right? For a couple of seconds while you're passing this truck. No big deal. They drive by and all of the communication in your car fails and your brake and your throttle don't work. That would be a completely different problem. But the security implication of being able to jam those things, right, is, to me, that would be a huge problem. Because it's not hard to jam things. Denial of service by flooding a broad spectrum radio is easy. Yeah, been around forever.
20, 30 years. at least.
130?
No, 20 to 30 years
No,
for like
130.
130?
As soon as we started using wireless communications, right?
Telegraph? Like, is there papers about security implications for the telegraph? Like, did I miss that?
Counting down the wires.
No, so not the
Indians.
telegraph.
A shark interferes, like.
Indians.
So we'll cut these wires and break the communication. So maybe not 130 years, but when was the first radio? So in the 20s?
I could see it being used for like World War I,
Mm-hmm.
because jamming would definitely be in use then.
Yeah.
I mean, World War II was the first television broadcast that could leave the atmosphere, so
But World War I, they were definitely using radios.
radios
But it
So,
might have
like
been,
they'd have a reason to jam. Like,
yeah, but even before World War I, there were other skirmishes in which there might have
You
been.
could
Like, as
jam.
long as we had radio, like, and they started using them to communicate, other people would start using them to jam. Okay, so back to this, choosing a venue. So the first thing in choosing a venue is it has to fit your topic. Or your topic has to fit the venue. So you can either have a topic and search for a venue, or have a venue and search for a topic. It can go either way. And I have definitely known people who want to go to a particular venue and figure out what can I do that will get me to that venue. There's nothing wrong with that, right? As long as you still do good enough work, right? If that's a good venue, that's a very good thing to do. It's like, what work can I do that will get me to that? If you're choosing a venue because, oh look, it's the Hawaii Systems Conference, right? In Hawaii, might still be okay if you're trying to figure out how to get your work to send you, so you can go network with those people and whatever. Well, it's a reasonable thing. Please don't use the taxpayer dollar. So the quality is one of the top things that I recommend you look at, right? How good is the system? Now, the U.S., most universities in the U.S. do not have a formal rating system in any of the CS departments or engineering departments. Most colleges of businesses in the United States do have a rating system. And so they will look at the tiers of your publication. So if you're thinking that you might one day be in an MIS program, then you might look and make sure you're publishing. In college of businesses that do information systems, journals still matter a whole lot. Conferences not so much. In CS departments, conferences are fine. But we still have a lot that goes into that. And I've talked about H-index, but if you have the formal rating system, if you Google for a conference and you find somebody saying, well, this is an A conference or a B conference, right? A's are better than B's or better than C's, right? There's tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. 1's better than 2's better than 3. If you can't find any of those things, it probably isn't a good venue unless it's extremely new. And then you're struggling to figure out what's going to go on. So, you can look at the H5 index factor or Google or the journal impact factor. The journal impact factor requires that that journal has been out at least 2 years because it's always a 2-year retrospective when they do it. So new journals have none. H5 index requires, right? H5 is the last 5 years that Google indexes, right? So a conference that's only been out 2 years may or may not even be indexed by Google, and even if it is, it may not have enough history to have a very meaningful measure. You have to look at it a little more carefully. So for quality for those things that are not, how do you decide this if it's very new?
Maybe read the journal and see what authors are in there and the quality of the papers.
You can do a little bit of that. So you can go look for how good are the papers in your opinion, right? So even if it's not a
I don't ask your advisor.
you can ask your advisor.
The default answer.
So, and your advisor will say, well, go research and come back to me, which is the full answer for an advisor.
Exactly.
But as I said, so like ICLR, right? So a lot of people respected ICLR instantly out of the box because some really good named people made it up for a good scientific reason. They didn't say, we're going to go start a new journal because we don't like you guys. There's a little bit of that, but no, mostly it was like, we're going to go start this new journal because this is a whole new area of research and there is no conference focused on it. And we want a conference focused on that. As opposed to, there are 36 conferences in this area, we're going to make a 37th, right? If the new one is very much like the old ones, it is either a political schism, which has happened, or a money or power grab, right? One of those two, right? Also happened, right? The latters tend to never produce good conferences. So just in general, they tend not to be. But every now and then schisms do. JMLR, as a journal, was a spin out from the Springer conference, or Springer, or maybe it was Elsevier. I don't want to get into it. A previously existing journal called Machine Learning. But they were having a bunch of practices that the editors really, really disliked. So they resigned en masse, 32 of 38 or so resigned, and went and formed a new open access free journal and said, we're going to be our own new journal, right? But because of the names of those people, you instantly knew that was going to be the good journal, and this other one was going to struggle to figure out what they could do. So new ones take a little bit of time to look. One of the good things is, because they're new, you might actually have a better shot. One, they don't have as good a process, and not as many people will be submitted because they don't know what they are. So if you see a good conference and you can get in early, might be a good opportunity to look at them. Obviously, timelines are important. One of the good things about conferences, they have hard deadlines. One of the bad things about conferences, they have hard deadlines. Right? So there is a deadline. You either meet it or you don't. I like it for my students because it is a clear deadline to hit. It is a function to help keep them motivated. In a journal, it's like, well, if we don't get it done this week, we can submit it next week, right? And it's easy to keep pushing it off. Conferences are absolute deadlines. And then there can be some other aspects of the impact of a venue. Is it open access? Who's the publisher? How easy it is to get things out? I have a strong preference for things that will show up in open access, like CVPR, like our venues. I will choose things that show up in IEEE Explorer that are more widely distributed than Elsevier, which is a much more tightly distributed thing. So you can look at that in terms of what is it going to be. So how do you find some venues? Well, you can actually just Google top conferences in XYZ for whatever you're doing, or top journals in XYZ. There's actually a website called Guide to Research that has lists of these. It's not bad. It's not perfect, but you know it's got some good data. Most of it is data driven, so it's pretty straightforward to find out what they are. If you're looking for venues and your goal is to find out what's coming up, so the one problem with this is it'll tell you the names, but it won't know anything about like what's the next major conference anyway. And obviously that's a conversation you can have with your advisor. But if you're trying to find new things, wikicfp.com is a website that has call for papers from all kinds of conferences. If you're a conference organizer, you can go there and submit, but even if you don't, they'll probably find you. They're pretty good if you're in any major venue. So everything that shows up in IEEE will show up in there. They tend to go crawl all the IEEE conference calendars and whatever. My recommendation is make a calendar. Oh, and I forgot, when you search for conferences, you'll also find not just places like this, various people in a research field will maintain a website of the top conferences, right, with deadlines, whatever. Those are really good because they're sort of like, here's the deadline, here's the submission, right? You can just gather all the information. So my recommendation is go find some top venues in your field. Who knows? It might be your next assignment. Search to make sure you're a good fit. So after you think you found a venue, I strongly recommend you go find a couple of papers and check. Are those what I would consider papers on par with what I want to submit? If they're way bigger than mine, way more theoretical than mine, maybe they're not the right fit. If they're way shorter than mine, right, they only do 4 pages, you got to figure that out. But that's up to you to make sure you're a good fit. I actually recommend you ask someone else to make sure you're a good fit. Who knows, like your advisor. But you can even ask some other random person, like, is this a good conference or whatever? Ask some people what they think. And read some papers from the venue. Read what you can about the review process. And actually, I said more on that later. Actually, I already put this a little bit earlier. You want to read what is the review process. Is there a rebuttal submission phase? Is it once and done? What kind of feedback are you going to get? So see what you can do. Because the more feedback you get early in your career, the better your papers will be. If you submit to a conference that you either get accepted or rejected and you get no feedback, that's not going to help you near as much as a place where you'll get good feedback. So most good venues do not allow double submission. Check before you submit. I already went through that, right? My recommendation is to think of your plan as a tier 1. If it doesn't get in, go to tier 2, go to tier 3, or a plan of try tier 1, then tier 2, and then either a 2 or a 3, right? And lots of conferences in most of the CS subfields have 2 or 3 conferences a year with mixed tiers, tier 1, tier 2, workshops at the main conferences or separate workshops. And my recommendation is you don't just plan for one venue, you actually plan a strategy that says, I do this, I learn this, I can either resubmit here or not, and then I can resubmit here or not. Right? So you understand where that process is going to go. Understand your commitment. You want to understand if you're going to have to review if you submit. If you've never had a paper published, they're not likely to ask you to be a reviewer. Until you publish, you're going to probably have to ask your advisor to be a reviewer. But guess what? If your advisor's on your paper, that might be what you're committing to. My advisor's going to be asked to review papers, which means I will be asked to review papers, which for your case would be good. Understand your costs and how you might reduce them. But understand your costs. Right? If your advisor, we as a PhD program don't pay you to go to a conference. That's between you and your advisor, your company, your spouse, your bank account, whatever it is, right? You have to understand what that cost is going to be, and you might be able to reduce it. Lots of conferences have opportunities to get a scholarship or to get a volunteer position where you might get free registration. Right? You might be willing to stay with friends, check your friend network that might be there. And there's nothing wrong in choosing a venue because you can afford to get to it, right? Especially when it's early on. Yes, there is this tier 1 venue in Tokyo, right? And there's this tier 2 venue in Aspen, right? Okay, you might choose the Aspen venue because you can drive, right? Even Santa Fe or LA is drivable if you got a car and a little bit of time. So choose your venue, come up with a plan, and my recommendation is you come up with that plan before you finish writing a paper because different styles will end up be where you're going to go. And as I did mention, right, costs for journals. Most journals, I thought I had this up here. Maybe it's later. Most journals, the base paper is free. There are some journals for which there is a fee to publish. Okay? And that leads us to open access and predatory. Open access journals, open access conferences, simply means free to read. Anyone can access it. It's open in terms of access. Open access can be fully compatible with peer review process. There are really good things that are open access, and there's absolute junk. No one reviewed it, right? Open access does not mean the author pays. There are many models being tested in the open access world. So IEEE access, I think, is, if you want to pay an IEEE for it to be open access, you got to pay. And IEEE has this mixed model. You can pay and it's open access, or you don't pay and it's not open access. There are some journals where you have to pay. My recommendation is, if you have to pay, really check the journal to make sure it's not predatory, which we'll get to in just a second. Open access journals can be high quality, just like subscription journals. I think there's actually a greater variance. Can open access have prestige? PLOS One, which is one of maybe the largest journals in science in the world, has an estimated 8,000 articles per year. The journal impact factor is 4.5. It's 10th in the general biology journals, and it's a pure open access journal. Everything is open access. PLOS Biology has got a journal impact factor of 12.96, right? It's 8th in the biochem journals. It started in 2003, and again, open access. Both of those are open access, and the author pays, right? But you don't pay a lot, but you still pay something. CVPR, which is the most cited CS publication of any form, has been in IEEE, but has also been open access since 2011. And in our own measurements, that the citation rate of our conference has increased significantly as we move to it being open access. So this was a fun negotiation, but to make it happen. But we are IEEE and our own website with all of our papers published on it. Lots of other places, you get this open access model of you publish it in the conference and there's a bunch of archive papers. Not organized, not anything else. We have our own organized access for our stuff. So is open access a flash in the pan? Probably less interesting now to ask this question than it was a decade ago when I first started this class. But there's a whole bunch of places. There's more than 10,000. In fact, I should have updated this number. There's more than 15,000, not 1050, it's 1500, fully open access peer-reviewed journals, and probably more like 5 million articles. I don't know these, but they're pretty old. Obviously, new titles come out every day with that many things. Open access journal is not the whole story. As I said, there's this whole thing of playing with things like repositories, like archive. Most non-open access journals allow authors to deposit their articles in an institutional or direct repository like archive. If you submit a journal paper, I actually encourage you to submit the paper to archive, right, and submit it to the journal. Check the journals, but almost every journal you're going to submit to in CS is fine with the paper being in archive before you put it in the journal. One of the things that they know is that if your paper starts getting lots of citations in archive, it's not going to hurt them, because very few papers get a lot of citations and then die off, right? Normally, if you get a lot of citations, it keeps growing for a while, right? And by the time it shows up in the journal, then they will be getting the citations in the journal.
So you would recommend submitting your stuff to archive regardless, either prior to or simultaneous to?
Oh no, in fact, I would strongly recommend you do it prior to. Right? This comes back to the copyright ownership issue, right? While you still own the copyright, you can give a copy to archive. Then you can give a copy to the journal, and you know what's going on. If you give it to the journal first, you have to now look through the copyright agreement you assigned with them, right? Because it's your burden to make sure you don't violate their terms. If you put it in archive first, and they're aware of it, then it's their choice if they want to accept the paper or not.
Right. Okay.
So you're better off that way. The other is, right, so the only two reasons I recommend not putting a paper in archive is if you think there might be something wrong, and I'm not sure, I'm going to wait until it goes through the review process and sort of see, because something smells a little off. So I'm going to wait, right? So code smells. But maybe there's something else wrong.
Or for that. Code science.
But the other reason would be because you are worried that somebody else can actually execute on your research ideas faster than you can.
That's what I'm afraid
okay? And therefore, you don't want to put it on an archive because as soon as somebody says, oh, that's a really good idea, that's such an easy thing for me to do, then they can beat you to the real paper, right? But if that's the issue, have a real conversation with your advisor because the question is not could they, but would they?
Yeah.
Because the good thing about archive, right, if somebody could beat you to your research,
Don't they have to cite you?
well, if it's an archive, they should, right? There's always this question of whether or not they ever found it, but
Yeah.
because archive is not considered peer publication, lots of places don't make you cite archive
Oh.
because their view is it wasn't peer reviewed. But long term in the community, if your paper was out there first, right, even when they go to publish it, if they have ripped off your idea, you get to cite, well, this paper was a follow-on for that paper, and then they look bad, right? So they're not as likely to do it. But you have to ask yourself, if my paper is something that they can beat me to, could they beat me to it without me ever telling them? In which case, I get no credit. As soon as you put it on an archive, you have some claim to credit because the idea was out there first in the public in a way that you can't control. So if they publish after that, then they're clearly a follow-on to your idea. So that's your biggest risk of not publishing is that they beat you and then you get zero credit, as opposed to they do it. But if your idea is a follow-on that's going to improve somebody's system, there's even a better approach to that research. What do you think that might be? Instead of saying, well, they can just beat me at the research, what else might you do? Since this is your problem, Heather, let's look at you. You can work with them, right? In fact, what you could do, in fact, here's what I recommend. If you want to work with them, put your paper up on archive, send them the copy and say, hey, you know, I just did this, and it would be such a natural thing to work with you to follow on to this. Are you interested? Because now you've claimed the credit. Because if you ask them up front, then there's still the risk that they can say, we're already working on that. No, go away. We've already finished it, right? If you published it first, now they're like, well, you know, let's see what they do. So they can look at it. So, and then the last reason to not publish something in archive is because you don't want anyone to have an idea that you're working on it, which is more of an issue if you're in a company space, or if you want to file a patent. There's this funny balance between how early do I file it, or do I finish until the work is completely done. And so there's a balance in there, but not as much an issue for an academic point of view. Okay, so got off topic, but so we publish for prestige, but we also publish to be read and cited. Some research has shown that OA articles in good venues are cited 25 to 250% more than pure toll access things. So your choice of a venue that allows open access, like CVPR, we're in the middle of that. We're probably between 50 and 100% increase in our papers' citation rates after we became open access. Within 2 years of that change, right, even before our conference became really big, we were getting many more citations. Why? Because there's lots of people around the world who don't have library access, right? They can't see the papers. And especially now with Google Scholar, they go to Google Scholar, and what papers do they click on? They click on the ones that have a link on the side that they can get to, right? And if they don't, there's another paper on this list, I'll just read that one instead. So Google Scholar is feeding this, making it a more prevalent thing. If they're directly linked to Google Scholar, more likely you will get more citations to your papers. So you want to make them easy. Now that's where the advantage of archive still works, because for your papers, if there's an archive version and a published version, eventually Google Scholar will merge them. But in the beginning, your archive paper will collect citations. And then this is the reason that a number of journals don't mind that you have it on archive first. When they merge them, the number now shows up, if it's done properly, with the archival conference or journal as the thing, or they count them all. So Google Scholar takes our paper. We had a paper that had 24 citations in archive before it got published. So, right, so now that it's been published, that conference sees like 30 or somewhere, whatever's in it, right? So you go down that path. So it can really help get your work out, especially when you're early on.
So I mean, obviously big conferences don't have this problem, but you know, I thought library access was one of the ways that some of these journals and different places made their dollars. How they make their money nowadays.
That's one of the problems journals are facing. So as I said, as journals have dealt with this. But,
I mean, t-shirt sales, and there's so much you can do.
No. So I've had lots of conversations with Springer, where I used to be an editorial board member, and with IEEE. both of them are struggling, but both of them are still making money. Oddly enough, the libraries are not subscribing because things are out there. So the reason IEEE has adopted pretty much this, you can pay and it's open access, or you don't pay and it's behind the paywall, is as long as a large enough fraction stay behind the paywall, libraries are going to keep signing up for it, right?
Are they? I mean,
They haven't dropped, so IEEE has not seen a significant decrease, I haven't talked to them in 2 years, but they had not seen a significant decrease in library subscriptions. They had seen a significant decrease in industry subscriptions, but not libraries. So industry is a different category.
yeah.
Most industry subscriptions were not considered library subscriptions. But I think the other part of that is overall R&D in industry expenditures are going down. So I don't know that the library rate is much worse than.
Yeah. And I mean, IEEE has membership fees. And all that
They have a
kind
bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
They make serious money from the membership fees.
Yeah.
But the journals, so journals still make money from page charges, but this whole open access model is literally, they're saying, okay, here's on average what we make from a paper. So this is what Springer has done and what IEEE is doing, but Springer has a couple that are pure open access. Everybody pays, and IEEE is still all this mixed model. But if I recognize that on average, this paper will generate $3,000 of revenue, then I can charge you as the author the $3,000 instead of making it up on the back end, right? And now you get the choice of doing that. Now what's funny is, right, so $3,000, between $1,000 and $3,000 is sort of the norm for IEEE oriented papers. That sounds like a lot, but if you think about how much it costs for you to go to a conference, this is part of what they base their what is it the market will bear? Well, to fly to a conference, pay the conference registration fee, stay for a week, might cost me between $1,000 and $3,000. So it's not much different than paying for a conference. Now, at a conference you get social interaction, which for some people is good and for others is bad, and so there's a trade.
So now you have to, now I have to write my own paper as well as paper.
So, could you pay for it to be published? Yes. Should you? No. My recommendation for you as a student, unless you are independently wealthy and I didn't know about it, would be to find a journal that doesn't make you pay for it, and go the poor man's open access, which is you publish it in archive first, and then you submit it to a journal that does not charge you. It's true there are journals that will charge you, but don't choose one of those. You currently have a choice. And as the market continues to drive things, right, this will be an interesting question. So long term, the survival of journals, they worry a lot. They talk about it all the time. Why? Because the model, it used to be very, very expensive to run a journal. You physically have to deal with printers and converting text into plates and all this stuff, right? Now it's like, okay, I do an electronic file and it's basically sending it to a printer. Yeah, it's a fancier printer, but it's printed. And a whole bunch of journals are moving to the point where there is no print version. They're entirely online. And now there are two costs. The editorial board, which is generally volunteers, right, and a little bit of electronic and IT stuff, which scales really cheap, right? So JMLR, it's a good journal, completely free, everything's completely online, right? So there are choices that are free and open access. And because they don't cost much, the journals really worry. It's like, if those things really get credibility, it's going to work. Journals also worry about, and I'm falling a little bit behind, but open access has had a couple of advantages. As a scholar, you increase your audience. You get free, readers get free online access. If you're a teacher, you get to have free liability access for use in courses. From all of us, this is moving away from, in my view, is an unsustainable journal publishing system and conference publishing system where they charge ridiculous amounts of money. Conferences are actually not necessarily a whole lot better. Lots of conferences make millions of dollars for their organizers. Right. To me, is it sustainable? Maybe. Is it good? No. Right. That's not where our dollars. Right. I literally volunteer a lot for the Computer Vision Society, whatever, because back when I started doing this, I realized if I could save them $250,000 a year, it's like me investing $250,000 into my field. And philanthropically, I don't have $250,000 a year to invest. But if I can spend 100 hours of my time and I know what I'm doing, and I can reduce registration fees and keep the cost of conferences low, then I'm effectively doing it. So I've been investing for a long time in my field. The same is true with the journal publishing system. They make money, but I don't think in the long run it's the right place for us to go. So this is from Lawrence's study, which is actually pretty old now, 2001. But looking at, and this is early online, I'm going to bet if you did these numbers now, the numbers would be even more skewed. But he looked at the percentage of online articles that are cited more than offline articles. So if you look at this, there's a couple hundred where the online articles were cited less. But in general, this is a very heavily skewed and very long tail where there's papers that have way more citations, right? Because they're online articles than where they're not. And this was a nice study because this is back when some things had online and offline things that were easy to compare. But with IEEE's new model, you could probably do the same thing and sort of see what it is. So the research impact is really about the size of the research contribution to the paper, right? If you do open access, it can also help generate further research funding and contributes to the productivity and financial support of the institution, right? So overall, these things are all really good. We want to make them bigger. Advances the research career, and one of the things that have been most prevalent in the CV and ML community is about how much proper open access can improve the research productivity and the progress. One of the reasons we accepted archive and giving up a little bit of our double-blind reviewing process is it simply slows down research. If I have to wait from October when I finish the research until June, when people get to know what their research is, that's 9 months of anyone else not being able to make progress. Where if I can put the paper in archive, right, and have the paper in people's hands, then the research pace can quicken because they can be building on my ideas faster. Right? So we put it out there, we build on it, we increase that cycle time, then we can make more happen more quickly.
Do you see, like, secondary venues like Medium and these type of places becoming more important in academic research? Or I think it's always going to be the hallmark of the journals and the...
I am unqualified to answer that question.
Okay.
There's so much good material that comes out, like
Yeah.
professionally.
I've seen it increasing in its value, and
So
it goes to source of I don't know how to do something, therefore I go to.
right. So I think Medium is a lot like tutorials, right? In terms of what it is, right?
Yeah.
So is it
Please
the
break it down.
absolute state of the art? No, I don't see too many results first being published on Medium. Right? What I see is Medium talking about research articles, right, and interpreting them for people who haven't read them, or helping you understand how to combine things and put it together. So I think it's very valuable. But we've had textbooks and tutorials around for a long time, right? And they do get cited, but not in quite the same way as science papers, right? So there's a balance there. Go
I
ahead.
have a particular question with that, only because particular security moves very fast, right? So like I can find articles about what threat hunting is in Medium, and there are no academic articles about it at all. So here's a new technique. It's being used professionally. SOC analysts are using it. I can't reference it because it's not in a research article. It's in a Medium article. It's people talking about what they do in their workplace, but it's not peer reviewed. So like, how do I talk about it?
Well, so I mean, threat analysis and threat stuff is
Threat hunting.
Threat hunting?
It's like the new buzzword on top of like ML and AI.
yes,
Elk.
except
Something else.
Yeah, hunting elk, or linking it back to MITRE's attack framework.
right, so yeah, but those are really so. There's a distinction between is it a new concept
Yeah.
and is it being named, marketed, presented in a new way, right? So the core ideas of threat hunting are older than I am, right? They've been around forever, right? So, and what maybe you're not finding articles is like maybe you need to go Google Scholar.
Call it something else, maybe.
Or yeah, they might be called something else. So the whole terminology question, but also like they might be more from the 40s and 50s, right? Right, than modern stuff, right? But intelligence analysis has been doing threat hunting for a very long time, and so there's balance. But there's nothing wrong. You can cite a Medium article, right? You just have two things, right? It's not going to carry the same credibility, right? So, like, the same is true with magazine articles and even New York Times, right? They have lots of interesting things, but you generally want to dig back through them to the original sources, right? Now, if there are things that don't exist anywhere else, then you may not be able to do it, right? But maybe that suggests maybe there should be an academic article. There's an opportunity.
There
You're
is a
seeing
gap there. Okay.
there's a gap, right? Because then you can be the one that, and find the Medium article. It's like author. It's like let's do a more thorough academic article on this, you and I can work together. We'll turn that into a paper. So, and I don't know what Medium thinks of itself as an organization. I don't know anyone who's in that. Well, as an organization, right? They might say we do want to become, right? So when Archive first started, I will tell you, there were a lot of great skeptics about Archive. Right? There are still lots of skeptics about Archive. But Archive was very clear, right? Our mission is we give you a place to archive your papers. We make 0 comments about the content. We have the right to take down stuff that is copyright violations or various inappropriate material, right? But otherwise, we're not reviewers, right? So they made it pretty clear. The question is what the community did on top of that, right? Medium, I don't know what they don't have a clear mission of what it is Medium is going to do. Right? So if they want to start saying we're publishers of science, they could. Right? They'd have to come up with what's the review process. Because if it's just a bunch of hand-picked stories from editors, it's not science, right? If there's no peer review to go with it. And that's where I don't know even what their process is. I've never submitted to it. My students keep trying to get me to do it, but I don't know. Okay, so an author institutional self-archive version is a supplement to, not a substitute for the publisher's original version. And so your archive paper should be viewed as a supplement to the official publisher's version, right? And that's the way I like to think about it. It's an early preprint. During the editor review process, your paper will get better, will become revised, whatever. And so the paper will evolve. That's why Archive's idea of versioning was very good, because it allows you to see all the different versions. Link the self-archived author's version to the official publisher's website. Archive does this in an official manner. When your paper gets published, you can go back into Archive and you can say, here's the DOI of the official publication. And then Archive now knows this is the preprint of that paper, and possibly the errata of that paper. Pool and credit downloads count for the self-supplemented version, with downloads counted for the official version, right? So Google Scholar is doing this already. They're properly pooling the fact that the 2 papers are linked. And all citation counts eventually accrue to the official published version. This is why, and this is part of what was Archive's original design, right? This is why the publishers don't mind so much. So the fact that I had this Archive paper with 24 citations before it got published, now the publisher is starting with a base of 24 on that paper, right? As soon as the first citations happen at that conference, they're up 25, 25. It's good for them to have a higher citation count, even though it started in Archive. And since prestige is a big part of all journals, it matters. So now if we start looking at how often are papers cited, this is the other reason it becomes, again, these are old slides, but the numbers have gotten worse, not better. So this is from 2000, and you can sort of see this plot. There's how many papers are cited how many times, right? So this is from 425 articles with more than 200 citations. Sorry, there are 455 articles with more than 200 citations. So off this graph, there's a total of 425 papers. And this axis here is logarithmic, log base 10, right? So here we have 100 papers with 60, and the number goes this way. But you'll see that most of the papers are not cited at all. And from the UK, this is from a UK paper, the average number of UK downloads per paper is 10. Okay, so most of the papers published, right, don't get any citations, and on average they get 10. Right, and the average is important because there's a lot of zeros in that average. There's a whole bunch that get 100 or 200, and for every paper that get 100, there's got to be a whole bunch that get 1 or 2 because you've got to get the average down to 10. And it turns out that usage impacts are strongly correlated with citations. So the more people download your paper, guess what? The more they cite your paper. Not terribly surprising. The easier it is for them to get to and download, the more citations you will get out of that. So coming to back to the journal model. So the first model for journals is subscription. You subscribe, you get a journal. When I first started as a faculty member, I physically got paper mail, right, once a month with my journals in it. Right? I have a shelf full of them. Why did I do that? My library actually got the same journal, right? But I can't take the one out of my library for a week or two and take it home. I can't edit it and whatever I want. And I commuted a long way, so I wanted my own personal copies. This was called gold open access, free to the reader. The author pays a fee, hence the gold. You're paying for it. platinum open access, free to the author and free to the reader. So this is the tricky one. How do they make money at this? Well, they often make money at this because they're free to the author and free to the reader, but they're included in their premium packages. So one of the things that they sometimes do with the other open access is that you don't get them in your library package. So now your library is not seeing its utilization. And this is a game they're playing, in my view, with librarians. Librarians need to show that the library is used,
Right.
or the libraries go away. So there's a metric there, which is if I don't access it through the library, then the libraries don't see it. So oddly enough, this can actually still work for a publisher who's got a bunch of journals in a package, and we can choose one of them and say we're going to put that in our platinum package. It's free to everybody, but it still comes through the package, which gives some people a reason to do it. And then some of the platinum open access ones are advertising based. They literally have ads in their magazines, right? And so the ads cover the cost of everything else. Delayed open access model, which is subscription model like it is up here, but it becomes open access after some time. Our first year with IEEE in 2011, when we did this, that was actually our model. We was in IEEE and we released it 6 months after IEEE, but that was mostly because we knew how long it would take us to set everything up and we went that fast, so we were fine with that. But, and then the sort of green open access model, which is open access self-archiving, so a traditional publication plus archive, right? In my view, this is the best choice because it's free, it doesn't cost you anything, it gets you most of the advantages of open access, you personally, independent of who you work with. Some economic aspects. So the change from subscription finance journals to author finance journals has had many negative and unanticipated effects. The new business model focuses much more on authors as a revenue source and presents a very strong conflict of interest. More papers accepted equals more income. Right? If you are literally paying, and it used to be I was paid by subscription, which means I have to have enough quality that libraries care. If the authors are paying, I don't care what libraries think about it. I just need authors to pay. And if I can sell them papers, then I can get income, right? Not all subscription journals are bad. Not all open access journals are bad. But way more open access journals are bad. In fact, in the spike of predatory publishing, because they developed so quickly a reputation of being bad, a number of them stopped being open access, right? And they started being this sort of, this is another version of the gold. It's free to the reader, the author pays, and there's a subscription. So libraries are still getting it, but then they make the library subscription super cheap, right? So that the libraries get it very cheap because they didn't want to be full open access. So they wanted to play some games. So now what is predatory publishing? And so this is a term actually from Jeff Deal. I think he's the one who invented it, who's a faculty member up at CU Denver, but it's an international term. It's used all over the place, right? Predatory publishers are generally journals, but there are some lots of predatory conferences as well, that exploit the gold open access model for their own profit. They take advantage of and exploit or pander to scholarly authors who don't really know or choose to not know or not care about what's going on. They pretend to be legitimate journals, copying established journals with respect to journal websites and practices. Many do a poor job or fake peer review, right? So any journal that says we will review your paper in the next 2 days is clearly fake. Let's just be very clear about that, right? There is no journal that will review your paper in 2 days. Now, they can make a reject decision in 2 days, but they cannot make an accept decision in 2 days, right? No good journal will ever pretend to do that. And while Beal's original work, All Adjusted Journals, there's a whole lot of conferences as well, right? So here's the International Journal of Science and Advanced Technology. Call for papers for the October issue. Submissions due October 27th. Notification of acceptance, October 29th. Publishing date, October 31st, right? Serious publication review process here, right? You submit your paper, and 4 days later, it is in their journal, okay? A clear sign of a predatory journal. Now, it's not always so easy, but here are some of my top red flags for predatory conferences and or journals. If they email you inviting you to apply, especially with your name on it, they are almost assuredly predatory. Why? Because good conferences don't have to advertise with your name on it. Where do they get your name from? Well, from various lists of websites of campuses. Right? They will literally, if we published a list that said, here's all our PhD students, they would go crawl and find the email list. If you have published a paper in any conference or journal, your name and email address is part of that. They go pull those up. They just get them from all over the place. If you can't find it in Google Scholar or under metrics, there's a decent chance it's at least junk, if not predatory. And I want to distinguish those a little bit because some of these, and I call them junk conferences, but they might really be more networking conferences. Right? The Hawaii Systems Journal, or Hawaii Systems, HSS, there's going to be another S in there, something conference, right? Yes, it was in Hawaii, and lots of people like to go because it was in Hawaii every year, right? Their papers were generally really bad, but oddly enough, there were lots of really good people, and people would go to network with the other good people who wanted the vacation in Hawaii, right? So is it predatory? Not if you expect that you're going there mostly to meet with people. If you expect it to be a serious publication, maybe it is. Anybody who's got unrealistic review timelines, a conference that calls itself a conference as is part of a large multi-topic conference, or sometimes World Congress on, right? So if you look at a conference, and there are 5 different CS fields in the conference, it's almost always a for-profit conference trying to maximize how many people can come and make money, and they can make money from it. If they don't list a program committee, if they don't list the people who are in charge of the academic quality of the papers, bad sign. If it's an old topic with a new conference, as I said, new topics, new conferences are fine. Old topics where a new conference pops up, political or money is driving them, right? And then money is more often the thing. If there's no way to contact people, insufficient contact information is also true for journals, right? If you can't figure out how to contact these people, it probably isn't real. Because the ones who are fake don't want to be bothered with people trying to contact them to ask, is this real? Because they'd have to deal with that. Real conferences want to be able to make it easy for you to ask conferences, so there's some sort of generic email. If there's an unclear author fee structure, if somewhere they mention, right, author fee, and they don't say anything else about it, it's almost always bad, right? If the conference has been long going, you can only find out what the author fees are. Author fees being ridiculously high is another chance that it's a predatory conference, or it's an industry-oriented conference. Any conference that's going to charge you as an author a lot of money to publish the paper is generally a bad thing. There are some conferences that still charge page fees or whatever, which is really just progressive tax, right? Those who can afford can have a longer paper than those who can't afford, but everybody can publish an 8-page paper. You want 12, give us an extra $400, right? I actually view that as, and I've actually run conferences with that for a while, because it's like, well, I could make this into an 8-page paper, but it'll take me 4 days. The $400 might be worth it for me to just say, fine, I'll leave it at 12 and go with it. But if they charge you $1,000 for your paper, it is a predatory conference. If they charge you $4,000 for your registration fee, it may be predatory, or it may just be badly run, or high cost and worthy doing. If they have false index claims, I'll get to some false indexes in just a bit. Anything that's got a bogus index is instantly should be in your bad list, right? Which is, some of them will say, instead of having a blue scholar metric, they'll have like an international scholar metric, right? And then they'll have a number, right? And it's a metric they literally make up. But there's actually a couple of sites that are predatory that run sites that give you metrics, right? Because they know that if people can't find any metrics, they might not believe it. If they don't have an ISSN or ISBN, right, then and they're on a website, then it's also dubious in terms of where they're going to publish. So this is Beale's criterion for identification, many of which are also related. The publisher's owner is identified as the editor of each and every journal published by the organization. So this is another clear sign. If I have a journal, if I have like 4 journals, and the same person is editing more than one journal, always junk. There's no editor that says, I'm going to edit 2 or 3 journals from the same organization at the same time. No single individual is identified in any specific journal as editor. So they list journals and they don't list any people. Equally as bad, because now no one's claiming they're in charge. They don't have a formal editorial review board. No academic information is provided regarding the editor, editorial staff, or its review board members, or worse yet, inconsistent information. I have actually found myself on the editorial board of one of these because somebody asked me about it. It's like, no, That's not me, but they had me and an old university where I was 10 years ago, right? If it's that out of date, it's probably not a good journal. Right? If it's true, but more likely they just found my name in my old association, stuck that on their website, hoping people would look at it and say, oh yeah, that's a good journal, not knowing that I wasn't there anymore. They just didn't do their homework very well. Again, 2 or more editorial boards related. Journals have insufficient board members. A good editorial board, right? If you're publishing a good associate editor for an editorial board, will handle between 8 and 12 papers a year. So if the journal is publishing 20 papers a month, they better have an editorial board of like 25, 30 people, because that's just more work than most people would do as a volunteer service. There's little or no geographic diversity among the editorial board, especially for journals that claim to be international in scope. If they don't, if it's a particularly narrow thing, so there's like the Journal of the University of King Saud University in Saudi Arabia, right? Very narrow journal, right? Not very good journal, but at least it's okay if all the people are from King Saud University, because it's like the name is like, that's where we're from. If they say we're the International Journal of blah, and they're at one school, that's bad. Editorial board engages in gender biases, like say if there's no female, right? This may or may not be predatory in the broadest of Beal's senses, but this is on Beal's list. He considers it a consideration to look for as well. So predatory journals are bad because they have problems in the research culture. People have earned tenure and promotion through easy articles in predatory journals. A number of universities are moving towards having the use of predatory journals as a strong negative, not even as a forget it. It's like, if they publish in one of these, they are playing games. We don't want these people because we don't know how much we can trust anything. The role of merit academic advances is disappearing if you start playing these games. So never before has so much pseudoscience been published that looks like real science. Some of these papers are really bad science. Others actually look pretty good. The one thing that some of these places do is they actually have editors that fix layout and stuff, so they don't look bad. They look good. Their just content is bad. Some academic bases then become filled with this junk science. It's hard to tell what's good science and bad science. A number of these places are also places where people that have a political agenda will go to publish a paper so they can make it look like it's been published, because it has been published, just in a place that has almost no review process. So if I want to argue that there is no such thing as climate change, right, I can go publish for 5 papers. In fact, if I have enough money, I can go publish 50 papers. Now I can have this bulk of things that back up my claims, right, even though they're all weak. Because of this, there's also the expectation that it's cheap, easy, and fast to publish. Well, cheap and easy, yes. Fast, no. Right? That part hasn't gotten a whole lot faster because our review process doesn't get fast. Many people are in favor of open access or in denial about the whole problem with OA. Right? I have been fighting on our campus to get a more formal process about predatory journals and some way of handling it into the tenure criterion across our campus, because there are departments for which there are people doing this because they have to get tenure promotion. They have to have the criteria might say, I need to have 4 journal papers. They have no definition other than journal papers, so if I pay $1,000 per paper, I can publish 4 papers and get tenure. Is that what we need? Right? That's not what we really want in our system. We've got to fix that. Right? So, and oddly enough, it's possible for these to be published in open access and still yet effectively hidden. Some of these people publish it on a website, but once it's published, they keep it up for about 6 months to a year, and then it goes away. They didn't say how long they were going to keep it up for you, right? They just published it, right? It was published, it was there, then it went away. I can't remember if these are going to go away or not. So by using some of this stuff, there are documented cases of people who have gamed the system, not only in terms of being able to get tenure or whatever, but also playing games even with Google Scholar. Google Scholar will detect a certain number of things, and they're getting better and better at this, but so just go away. No. No. Oh, yeah, so we go. So metrics can be somewhat gained by these predators. So alternative metrics, ISI, Web of Science, all this can be done. And part of it's hard to say if it's intentional or just a secondary effect is a bunch of these things are causing a backlash by some people against metrics because the metrics can be gamed, right? As opposed to not having any metrics means everything is gamed in my view, but I'm much more of a metrics guy. We can try and fix the metrics. So this guy was sort of interesting. This is a particular case, and I've removed the name to sort of show what's going on. but Beale wrote a particular blog article about this particular case. It had been discussed even before his blog article, but he wrote this long blog article. So Google Scholar had this person having 171.11 citations, and after they detected this cabal that was actually all the same person publishing in for-profit journals under fake names with bad papers citing his own work, right? Google decided, no, he's actually down to 150. And so, you know, there's this whole set of articles, but I'm not including them up here, right? But like you can sort of see, like, this is the year the guy was up for tenure, right? Well, let's see. I have no publications. I got a couple in the queue. Now I get a whole bunch of citations. Now and now I'm done, right? The case wasn't detected until I think 2017, and there's been a dozen or so cases where the problem this presents is that people can basically meet the official criterion by having fake material, right? There have been discussions of, I'm not sure if there's any hard documented cases, although some of these are comments from friends I know of, and so I believe it's true, where there's a variant of this where people are encouraging various students in India, I don't want to choose them, but my friends are from India, so this is really just a particular story, where they're encouraging the students who want to get into grad schools to all, and some of them come from families with money, so the idea of paying $1,000 to get an article published is nothing, right? It's fine. They would pay that much to go get studies. So they say, well, here, go publish this article, and they are actually writing the articles, giving them to students, who then go publish them under their own name, citing back to the people's work, so they can grow their reputation. And that's not quite the same as this. It's going to be a whole lot harder to detect, because if you dig into it, the student, I mean, some of these cases, it was actually easy to show, like the same IP address submitted paper. Right? Now I've given papers out to students who go submit them in their own name, rewrite them, but some of the core stuff, there's almost no way to detect it. That's why I said there's been no hard documented case of this, because it's so hard to prove that it happened. But it's problematic. Given the time, I'm going to skip over that one. So there are, I just want to point out a couple of these fake impact factors. These are ones where you can go to websites and look up the impact factor of various things. And to make it way more confusing, almost all of these sites rip off actual impact factors from other sites, so that if you look up a correct journal, you'll get a reasonably good, but not actually exactly the same, impact factors if you went to ISI. So Cosmos Impact Factor, Institute for International Research Impact Factor Journals, International Journal Impact Factor, and International Scientific Indexing. So ISI, right? This one is actually, I think, gone, because they literally used the same acronym and got sued. The rest of them still exist, right? But this was particularly good because it's like, well, we're indexed by ISI, just not the real ISI. But if you set up in the appropriate country, this one I think was in Pakistan, right, for which we did not have good IP interaction laws, and so it's like, we're the only ISI in Pakistan, we're good. You got to figure out what's going on. So, but predatory journals often advertise these fake impact factors to help confuse people who don't really know what's going on. So you should be aware that even they've gone farther down that path. And I'll put these slides are already up online, right? So there's a whole bunch more if you want to read about things. Now, a couple of things that I want to differentiate from predatory publishing are some quasi-predatory policies, or possibly very valuable policies where you are. So a number of journals have policies such as copy editing, pre-publication peer review, statistical methodology, and research promotion. These are sites such as NDAS, NTAG, and Rubrik, right? All of these are commercial sites that will help you get your paper published. Are they predatory? Personally, I think they are charging more than they should, more than they could, in terms of helping people, but they do provide real services. They actually will help you with your grammar. They will help you with your statistics. They will help you with your research promotion, if that's important. There's a whole bunch of people for whom they have money and they want to figure out, how do I get this paper done, right? So to me, this is sort of this gray green area. People are paying to make it easier to get stuff published. I don't actually consider this predatory. but the quality of what you get out of them can vary a lot, and how much is it worth also depends on where you are. Right? And I can't complain too much because I regularly pay to have people proofread my papers because I can't. Right? I can proof listen, but I can't proofread. So you go into fair that goes. Now, in the last 12 minutes, I'm going to hit a little bit about some submission processes to journals, just so you can sort of get a feel for it. So I'm going to use TPAMI. I was on the editorial board, and I have all these. The journal I'm on the editorial board for now, T-Bio, has similar things, but it has less of a history, and so I just want to use TPAMI because it's more prestigious. So a TPAMI position is based on a previous conference paper. IEEE requires the journal paper be a substantial revision of the publication. 30% is generally considered substantial. If it's less than 30%, we'll say, no, it's too similar. As I said, very often, they'll take your long paper that had a lot of the old conference paper, send it back to you and say, make it a short paper and cut out a bunch of stuff. So then it'll be easier to see what's new. They talk about some of the examples of what's improvement. All of this is on the if you just go to TPAMI website, you'll sort of see what goes on. And for reasons I don't understand, oh, it shows up here, fine. So they have a couple of different papers. A regular paper, 14 columns, double space, so that's a much longer paper. 8-column double pages, right, using the CS template. So their template is a little bit more dense than most conferences. So 8 pages is probably about 8.5 to 9 of a normal conference template. The 14 pages, it's much bigger. And they have 2 others, a 2-page comment paper and a 20-page survey paper. And all of these include figures and references right inside of them. The figures are tricky because when you submit them, the figures don't show up in the right place, and so it's harder to count, but it's approximate. They give you an approximate size of the page, and they have a template where you can download the LaTeX template and do it, right? So when you submit to a journal, you have to choose what kind of paper is it you want to submit. One of my students and I was working on a paper, and he was aiming for a regular paper, and I told him the acceptance rates are easier if we do it as a short paper. And one of the things that's not on this list is TPAMI allows you to have supplemental information. A lot of journals have moved to having supplemental information, which is published only in the online version, not in the paper version. And so it doesn't cost them anything, so it's easier to get those extra pages in that way. Most IEEE journals use something called Manuscript Central, sort of a number of other journals and a few conferences, which is really worked on by the author. So you basically go in and you have to have the title, the email address of all your co-authors, abstracts and keywords, which you really get from the manuscript itself, your manuscript document, either as a Word document or a PDF with embedded graphics. I strongly recommend you do the PDF with embedded graphics. They sometimes mess up Word even if you give it to them. And in the end, for almost all IEEE journals, you're giving them LaTeX source. You're not giving them a PDF. You're giving them a LaTeX source and they will reformat it. So you also have to identify, and I'll go through this in a couple pages, preferred non-reviewers, disclose relationships, so the previous publications, put a PDF file in, accept the copyright, right? Timer equipment, so IEEE says it's less than 5 minutes, and this may be true if you have all the things ready and you've done it 15 times. It's usually an hour to 2 hours the first time you go to do it as you try and go back and copy things around. The biggest thing is that having all the things ready makes it straightforward. So you go into the system. Once you're in as an author, you basically click to add the thing, click on invited manuscripts. If your manuscript was invited, sometimes you fill them in that way. You copy your title, you put it in, you put them in these boxes. And these things, like your title is limited to 50 words, your abstracts is limited to 200 words. This is one of the places where people go in and it's like, oh, my abstract is 240 words by their word count. It doesn't matter what your word count is, it doesn't matter what theirs is. So you'll have to edit it down and make it fit. Keywords, right? So they have this long list of keywords. And this is one of the places where I actually recommend you try and find your keywords in their list to use exactly the words they have instead of your keywords. And the reason that's important is because inside this system, they also have a whole bunch of reviewers for which they have attached their keywords to their reviewers. And it makes it much easier for the editor if they can match your keywords to somebody in the list, because the system will automatically suggest them. If you make up a new keyword, it doesn't actually help them because no one in the system will have that keyword. So I would recommend, it turns out later on if the paper's accepted, you can change the keywords. So change them then to the ones you really want. Here, use the ones they have. So then you can add any co-authors. So you have to have the email address and all the proper institutional information for all of your co-authors. You don't get to have them, if they're on the paper and not on the system, the associate editor might send it back and just add a couple extra weeks to your time because people are missing. You're allowed to identify authors or individuals with conflict of interest. And so one conflict of interest will always be your advisor. And my recommendation is your advisor is a lifetime conflict of interest. Most of the organizations consider it that. Why? Because it's our job to promote you as our student, right? So it's a conflict of interest. The good thing is if you put that in first, now they believe that everyone you have said is a real conflict of interest, because it really is, right? But you can also add your people that you have a ideological difference with, that you know this person will try and kill this paper. You can still list that as a conflict of interest, right? Because you just don't agree. And anyone you have a financial tie to. So if you have a co-author who's working for a company, then there's something. Turns out that using your domain, like where you work for an institution, they're going to automatically do that anyhow. They're not going to send it back to somebody at the same institution. But other relationships might exist. A cover letter is optional, but I strongly recommend it. I, as an editor, always read the cover letter for two things. First, it helps me understand what the authors think is the most significant parts of this paper and what they're trying to accomplish. And to me, it also makes it easier because I can read all that very quickly or have it read to me. But also, you can put in a list of potential reviewers. It's optional. The system has no way for you to put in optional positive reviewers. But if you can recommend to me as an editor 2 or 3 people that you think would be qualified to read this paper, and I don't see a conflict of interest, then I'm more likely to use those, so I don't have to do as much work. I will never use all of yours, but I might use 1 or 2 of them because it makes my life easier to say, oh, they think this person is qualified. I look at who that person is. They're good, fine, I will use them. Right? So it can make both my job easier and help you get somebody you want. And then at the bottom of the page, there's like, has this been submitted? And if so, yes. It asks for like, what is the manuscript ID of the previous submission? This is why I don't like this in the cover letter. If the paper's been submitted someplace else, say so in the cover letter. Say where. And my recommendation is put a link to it so the author, the editor can go see it. Right? This manuscript ID exists within IEEE for IEEE. But I don't know the manuscript ID of my own papers, right? So how will other people know it? So put it in the cover letter as well. If it's approved, are you willing to pay the fee required for color reproduction? They charge you if you want color pages, so my answer is say no. Don't pay extra if you don't want to. But if color is critical for your work, I paid for it for the papers that were like on color segmentation, because it needs color. And then you're going to basically, that you're giving them the copyright, and then you're confirming the research is ethical and a bunch of other guidelines. So, then you browse and upload the file, upload the main document, click upload, goes through some process. You can upload more than one file. If you have, upload as many as you need. So if you have, for example, your main thing and then supplemental material, upload them as 2 pieces, not as 1, because they might argue the page count stuff, so make the supplemental. And then when you get done, you have to proofread your PDF. This is another thing that I found annoying. I've had a student like, I went through all the stages, right, and you can't actually click on the submit button because it says you haven't reviewed, so you have to look at it, make sure it looks okay on their system, and then you can review it. And then that's pretty much it. You receive an email telling you what's going on and some tracking information. There's this transfer copyright button, which gives you the IEEE e-copyright application, which you eventually have to do. Turns out you don't actually have to do this before the paper goes under review, but you will have to do it before it gets published. So my recommendation is just do it while you're going through that process. And that was it for today. Any questions on the publication process and stuff? Yeah, so it's a lot. It will all be online for you to review. All the slides are there. So because of last week I messed up, right? I didn't have all the audio, and in fact I fought with laptops. So over the weekend I have not yet gotten a new one. I did not re-record stuff, so I am pushing the draft of the survey paper to be not this week, but next week, because I didn't notice that the audio wasn't up there until I got a message from one of those students, and I haven't had time to fix it. So the draft of the survey paper will not be next week; it will be the week after, which is closer to midterm, and I'll post the assignment with that today. For those of you who want to do more research-oriented paper, I gave you some motivation today why you still have to do a survey, but if you guys want to focus on your research paper, focus on that for now. I'm good with it.
I was going to say, like, I gave you a rough draft of my research paper, not a rough draft.
Well, no, that's what I'm going to. No. So it's fine to do a rough draft of your research paper for those of you doing it, right? Everybody will eventually do both. You guys want to do research first and survey later. That's okay. We'll mix it up. So you'll get more feedback on whichever one is first and whichever one is latter. So, okay. Thank you.